today to look more so at those rezonings of those parcels that where we heard the most concern, particularly in the Beachwalker upper parcels and Beachwalker lower parcels. As part of that initial workshop, and I just want to confirm with the commission, just if you guys can kind of give a nod or kind of a thumbs up of the remaining amendments felt comfortable enough to move on for a formal recommendation. But we would not make a recommendation formally on these parcels today. This was just more so for us to have some more discussion and more dialogue engaged with the standards that would be applied to those Beachwalker parcels. Is that kind of an understanding of, from our last meeting, that I think it was Commissioner Curran who made that recommendation that essentially 70% or more things could be moved forward based on a comfortability from the remaining amendments that were proposed, but the ones that were unready for a formal recommendation by the commission, particularly those on Beachwalker, we would continue to study, continue to provide some opportunity for engagement on that. I just wanted to make sure that that was shared. So the second component to that initial workshop was the ability for some adjustments to be made to the staff's initial recommendation. So that's what's been shared with you today, some recommendations based on that feedback. And additionally, there were several questions that came up during that initial workshop. And so today I wanted to provide just some additional context and answers to some of the questions that did come up during that initial workshop. And so with that, Mr. Chair, I'll kind of get started. And I'm going to get up from my seat and go to the podium because I want to share just a couple slides here. So one of the questions that arose at our previous workshop was the recommendations, how were they considered? And what I did is put together a list of exactly how those recommendations that you saw for each of the parcels were prepared. And so these are the considerations from a staff perspective of the things that felt important to consider in rezoning these parcels. The first being existing zoning standards. And this represents what's currently allowed by those standards today for each of the parcels. So it doesn't matter where the parcel may be located, what are those existing standards today? And that may be based on the 2013 amended restated development agreement, as well as our zoning code. Additionally, existing land use patterns. This is how these parcels have been developed and how they've been used, both adjacent to subject parcels as well as across the island. We look at land use patterns and existing conditions to fold into that number of measures for the recommendation. The third is past and present development typologies. Kiawah has a very unique typology as far as the development. And so from a proposal of how parcel could be developed, that was also folded into staff's recommendation. The current future land use designation, another measure that was folded into this process of how these recommendations were put forth. And this represents within our comprehensive plan the future land use designation. And this is in accordance with how properties intend to be used in the future. And each of these are spelled out within our comprehensive plan. Three others, community feedback from recent development proposals. Beachwalker has been in a unique area on the island that has had a lot of activity as far as interest from the community. And so those considerations have been taken into staff's recommendations, best practices. These are planning and zoning methods that are not just applicable to Kiowa, but applicable to measures across municipalities, jurisdictions all over the world. And so for Kiowa, the consideration here was that our zoning code standards have been essentially the same for a very long time and does not apply the opportunity for modern standards. And so that was built into the considerations for staff recommendations. And then the final thing that's listed here are legal implications. And so as part of any zoning change, there are legal aspects that are important to consider as part of this process. And so that would include both local and state law and how those things impact how property may be changed from their use, intensity, et cetera. So that I wanted to do, at least share with you at the beginning of this, address those questions that came up of how these recommendations that weren't just pulled from thin air, that have been maybe shared within the community, but these were factored in by a number of measures here. I can pause and allow anyone to have any questions about how these were shared before I move on to one of the next. Okay. So as part of this process as well, one of the questions that came up was the reverting back to the current zoning prior to the 2013 development agreement, and why can't that just automatically apply to these subject parcels? So in your materials that I shared with you this morning, there are several maps. What I want to do is go through those maps. I'm going to pivot one more time here and kind of share sort of a timeline. So, oh, you guys can't see that, sorry. Can you check the connect? Let's do this. Not sure why that did that. Thank you for your patience. I apologize here. So I want to begin currently where we are today and showing a few exhibits here. You all are familiar with this map here. This represents our current zoning map. And that, this particular map is what was in place based on our 2015 comprehensive plan amendment and zoning maps. And there have been very few changes since then to the overall entire map, particularly when we look at the Beachwalker parcels. So this represents our current zoning map. I'll go through the big spreadsheet a little later to reflect the standards that are there, but these are the parcels of our current zoning map. And so the question that was arise at our previous meeting of what would happen if the development agreement go away with the previous zoning for these standards is what I want to address today. You go to your exhibits, you'll see this map in your materials. This is a land use map that shows the designations for Kiowa based on a land use category. And you can see that this yellow color, I'm going to kind of zoom in here, but this yellow color here represents multiple use. And this is a land use designation for this. This dates back to the 90s. And I'm going to show you the subsequent zoning map. So this is the zoning map that is associated with our 1994 zoning code. So in 1994 is when the State Enabling Act required that towns, municipalities, comprehensive plan and zoning be administered. Prior to that, Kiowa, as you all are familiar, was a planned development district with Charleston County. And so this particular zoning map set standards of areas. And what I want to do is highlight what these areas are based on our subject properties for today, which are these uniquely kind of pink colored areas. It's not showing really well on this image, but essentially this area here, you can see my cursor. You can obviously see the red commercial areas that are at the corner of Kiowa Island Parkway and Beachwalker Drive. Those still, this is that commercial corner here. These areas where my cursor are, those represent this kind of pink faded color on this map here, but they essentially marry to this designation that's called special development. And that special development, you can share a copy with all of this. This special development category and purpose of today is no longer in our current zoning code. So if you just search our current zoning code, this zoning district of special development is not within our current code. And so prior to our 2013, even our 2005 and 1994, all of those zoning district maps allude to this particular area as having a special development area. And I want you to flip to essentially the last page of that document that I shared with you. You'll see special development highlighted in table. That special development areas, it quotes, to provide the opportunity for development of a variety of uses on a parcel pursuant to a development agreement. And so these parcels, where you look at the maximum density intensity, the uses allowed, those married to the development agreement. This is a very unique situation because most municipalities have not had a development agreement in place since its birth. And I'm saying since its birth just based on sort of when the town was formed and when our zoning code came into effect. That's a very unique situation for Kiowa to have a development agreement that essentially outline standards for particular parcels. And this is all identify specific parcels. So this is not across the island. You can see that there's still R1, R2, R3 properties. Even there's an RE category there that's no longer in our zoning code. And that was the intent to reflect the Eugenia area, which was a earlier developed area on Kiowa. And so these are areas within our zoning map and our zoning code that are no longer in our current land use and planning zoning ordinance. And so as part of this process, at the expiration of the development agreement, it's important for us to rezone these properties to the appropriate zoning district that they should be. So I just wanted to provide sort of a quick timeline overview of that. I'll pause here again and ask if there are any questions there on this particular segment of questions. Mr. Iwan?
So, when the development agreement expires, are you suggesting that those properties would go back to the 1993 special development classification?
No, so I included, I went at the beginning, I went all the way to the end. So if we go strictly on the 2013 development agreement and say if those particular maps were no longer in place for the development agreement, you would actually go to the 2010 zoning map. So I apologize, I did not go through the 2010 zoning map, but if you pull up the 2010 zoning map, which is in your materials as well, it's this map. This would be the official zoning map prior to the 2013 map. And you can see still these same parcels, have this category of mixed use for majority of those except one, and that would be the former church parcel. But the remaining of those still have this residential, commercial, mixed use designation based on our 2010 zoning map. So to your question, if we were to say that the 2013 designations or standards apply, were to go away based on the development agreement, we would go back to the previous map, which was this one, and you would have that same situation, essentially because that development agreement is no longer in place as well. You continue to go backwards, that would end you up with that special development district that I referenced.
I'm still trying to put my head around, okay, which development map would be the one which would be the base development that would come into force at that point in time?
So the special development district, that's been there since our initial development agreement.
So we go back to 1993?
94.
94.
Yeah.
Okay.
I thought you just said 2010, which I'm trying to understand Larry's question too. When the development agreement expires, which zones are applicable if we do nothing?
So if we do nothing, that's the purpose of this rezoning. Of if there's no applicable standard in our zoning code, there's nothing to reflect previous designations of what these parcels standards would be outside of going back to that initial special purpose district or the planned development district that was outlined for Kiowa based on how Kiowa was first developed.
Say that again, please. If it expires, there's nothing in our current history that defines what this would be. Is that what you said?
What I'm saying is our current history for how these parcels have been developed have always been in accordance with a development agreement. And so since those development agreements are no longer in place, this is the time for the town to say, what do we want these parcels to be developed as? I mean, I'm sorry, not developed as, but zoned.
So it was suggested at last week's meeting that if it expired, there was a feeling that there was some comments made that it would default back to our R2 zoning and R3, I guess maybe it was R3 zoning. You're saying it's zero at that point in time, and we've got to establish it.
So if I understand you here, let me go to the current zoning map. This area that you're referencing here, so for example, parcels that are R3/C, those would automatically, if I'm hearing your question, would go to R3 opposed to C. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, I'm trying to understand and reconcile some comments that were made last week and kind of what you're presenting now. There was a perception that if it expires and we did nothing, it would go to R3. I'm just trying to see if that's the case or not.
There's nothing in my research that says that would be the case.
Okay, so it would be to something to be zoned as opposed to in the unzoned area in our map.
Right. So essentially, the thing that I'm trying to communicate here is that the best practice, the best unique situation for the town, looking at its zoning map moving forward, is to say, hey, these parcels have been associated with a development agreement that is no longer going to be in place. What do we envision as the standards for these properties? So the history is important, but I think the most important factor from a staff perspective is, where do we see ourselves for these standards for these parcels moving forward? Because there's a long history associated with a development agreement that's run its life and done its job for the most part in the development of this whole island. And so whereas we are today, can we identify what would be the appropriate standards that would apply to each of these specific parcels? Because the development agreement did not look at the entire island, it was very parcel specific. So we're looking at very specific parcels and saying, now that our development agreement has ended, which has been our planning tool that we've utilized since our inception, that's been, however anyone feels about it, good, bad, or indifferent, it's been the planning tool utilized to how Kiowa has been developed for these areas. And so since that has gone away, what should we do as a planning commission, make a recommendation, and what should council say these parcel standards should be? And so as part of this process, that's what this workshop is entailing, that we can look at these standards, make some recommendations, have some discussion, and say this is most appropriate zoning for these areas.
Okay, so what you're saying is then, when the development agreement expires, it doesn't if we did nothing, it does not automatically revert to the 2010 zones, whatever. We need to take an overt action to assign zones to these parcels. And when we do that, we don't, as I understand the ZLDR, it's an either or. It's not R3 or R2/C. It's R3 or C, R2 or C. Our current zoning does not have, as I have, the dual thing. So when we look to what is the appropriate designation for these parcels, we should look to. Go ahead,
I'd just like to suggest that, that's moving from the point that we want to be proactive in assigning zoning. The questions you raised would be raised at that point in time. At this point in time, I think we need to understand more, what the situation is going to be at that point in time.
Right, do we need to be proactive, or if we just sit back and fold our hands,
Right,
what happens? That's what I'm trying to understand. If we do nothing, what happens?
I'm advising that we don't do nothing.
I know that, but we want to know what happens if we do nothing, so we understand what our choices are.
So my understanding is that if the town does nothing, that it would be unclarity of what these parcels standards would be, because they're associated with, I'm sorry?
So it does not revert. Because I think some of us thought it would revert to.
If you use that same principle of reverting back to the 2010 zoning standards or zoning map, we would be in the same place that we are today with an expired development agreement that has standards reflective of things that were in the development agreement. So we would be back in the same position of looking at 2010 to where we are today and to 2023.
Yeah, you just said something that caught my attention, is that you just said it would be unclear as to what the zoning would basically, that suggests to me that it could be disputed.
Yes.
And John, I think I understood from your historical perspective was that if nothing is done, and I recognize that it's not your recommendation, but if nothing is done, do we actually, do those parcels actually revert back to special development, and that is a category that no longer exists?
Correct. So there is no special development category within our zoning code. So if
Or we need to do something.
I can live with that language.
Or does it just, or no standard?
So there's no standards. So if you,
That's why.
Okay, I see, just, we're trying to establish the baseline of understanding.
A baseline of if we do nothing, what happens? So are these parcels sort of, if we do nothing, are they just out in the Netherlands? And then we have
One at
those-
a time, sorry. I need one at a time so I can in here. So, Ms. Hennessy, go again?
I just want to understand if we do, and I think we're all looking for the same thing. We want to know what our baseline is, so we know what, if we take a proactive step, what we're changing from. So, again, I think if anybody has a clear understanding than I do, please explain it. If we do nothing, do these parcels have a zoning designation that would be applicable for an applicant coming to us and saying, we want to develop this, and here's our zoning designation? Does that exist?
That's the point that I'm trying to raise here. If once the development agreement expires and there's an application to these particular parcels, today, those standards apply to the development agreement. With those going away, we would look to the history of these parcels. They've always been associated with the development agreement. It's my recommendation that you all identify the standards that are associated with these particular parcels, because that provides the safety net for the town in moving forward in the future of how these parcels could be developed.
I think, John, could you just, I think their question is, it's almost like a yes or no, maybe. The question is, they do nothing, it goes back to the 2010. And then you're saying the 2010 lives in the ARDA. That goes away, the question becomes, from a staffing standpoint. What brings an application? We're looking at this saying, there's no standards in our zoning ordinance. Is that what you're saying? So therefore, we don't know what to do because the standards are gone, or the standards in the zoning ordinance is gone. The land use map is showing this, but our zoning ordinance, there's nothing in there for the planning department to say, what are the setbacks, blah, 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 blah. Is that what you're saying?
Right, so this, I go back to this.
It's unzoned, because essentially, we see that it should be this way, but it's not carried over to our zoning ordinance. So the
We
two.
should zone it all open space if we want.
So that's what this whole discussion is about.
So-
Just to be clear,
But
it goes away, and we're trying to say, let's not have it go away.
I have to have you use a microphone just because we're live, yeah.
So I'm hearing the same thing. Development agreement expires, the zoning goes away, there is no zoning. And that's what this effort right now is for, is to prevent us from having a gap in the planned zoning for that property.
So let me add to that what you're saying. There's still somebody who owns that property, and they have property rights. So it's, if, to use Marilyn's example, if we tried to zone it all park, people who own it probably say, you're taking away my economic value from this property. So we've got,
That's like,
comes to having a development agreement probably be the ideal resolution of this. In certain
Well, I don't know about having a development agreement, it sounds like what you're saying is the planning commission coming up with rezoning recommendation that may be, is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm just trying to understand is that it's,
yeah, that's my question as well, is that what is our obligation to these historical standards? I mean, what is the legal implications, like you mentioned, do we have any obligation to these historical standards, zoning standards? Or can we
So
start from scratch?
So one of the things that, just to your point of starting from scratch, I think you can take that approach, but I think it's more important to take all of those things in consideration, of those things that are outlined as part of the beginning slides of the things that the Planning Commission should factor in into how these parcel standards should be applied. So I don't think you can just say, hey, we have a vacant slot of land here, and we're just going to zone in anything that we want to. But I think there are contextual factors, legal implications, all those things that I outlined that I want you guys to consider as part of this process. Is there comfortability there? Okay. If it's not, I mean, we can ask a few more questions. I want you guys to be understanding the process here. So the last sort of takeaway from me, again, I'll try to reiterate, is the important factor from the town's perspective and the staff recommendation is this is the opportunity and the most clearest direct path to set standards for these parcels that have been associated with a development agreement that's been married to Kiowa since it's been born. And so that's the important thing from me to see is you're really evaluating these parcels from a zoning standpoint to apply. When we go into the actual standards that big spreadsheet that I shared with you all, we can talk specifically about all of those nuances of standards. But I want before we get into the weeds of standards, I want you to understand the principle of kind of why we're doing this in this approach.
Well, I do think that Ron raised a good point.
Turn your mic on. So the button turns, if you see green, it's on, yeah.
I'm not going to be a smart aleck. So Ron's question about legal implications, is there anything about legal implications of whatever action that we take, whether
There will always be legal implications.
can you go through those for us? Have there been discussions? Are there things we should be aware of, or that the community should be aware of?
So the legal things that, from a very high level, are, one was just mentioned, property rights. People look at the standards that are applicable today. I don't think that we would want to set ourselves up as a recommending body, as a town council, to say that we're downzoning property that it would strategically put the property owner at risk based on the value of that property being able to be developed. Those are one of those legal implications. And the other is due process, equal protection, those things that are outlined in our state law. The others that come to mind is standards of procedures. So this rezoning process, as I mentioned, it's a clean way to do this. I think if we go down a road of trying to, the recommendation, I'm not going to use recommendation, but the comments made of do nothing, I think that puts the town even at more risk, because if a property owner does come and say, hey, I'm submitting an application, then there can be, to this point, a dispute of what are the actual standards. And so I think from a risk standpoint, I think we would want to ensure that there are standards that we want applied to these parcels in the most clean administrative way, that they're, not administrative, but legislative way that they have been applied to these parcels.
I guess my concern really is one that's been expressed last week and at yesterday's council meeting and at today's workshop, and there are three primary issues that the community, that the neighborhoods have identified, and one is stormwater retention, one is traffic, and one is safety based on increased traffic along Beach Walker. So my question that ties into our recommendations, or what we move forward to council, is can we do something now establishing zoning standards that addresses those primary community concerns?
So I'm going to dive into this. If I'm doing a little bit of alluding here to some of the maybe reading between the lines of your question. The parallel tracks, if that's of development for these particular parcels, is that where you're heading with, if doing something from the town's perspective to those particular parcels? Is that where we're kind of driving?
I had that same question. It seems that we're in a process of making recommendations for rezoning, while there's also a parallel discussion, negotiation between the town and the developer for these contentious parcels. It seems like us making a recommendation for zoning when there's this parallel discussions going on, if we come up with a recommendation and it doesn't match what they ultimately negotiate out, then we're going to just have to change the zoning.
So
I think we make our best recommendation, whatever that is.
I know, but-
It's just a recommendation. They're going to either vote it in or say no, go back to the drawing board. since we haven't been privy to the
No,
details of the plat,
like I-
we just make a
I-
recommendation.
I understand.
What,
And,
what
you know,
what I hear, what I hear, Ron, though, is that, that from, and again, maybe I'm reading between the lines, is that we'll, as a town, would be on firmer ground if we do come up with a zoning recommendation. Even if it doesn't, even if something else is negotiated, we'll be on firmer ground, both from the standpoint of if it's challenged, and secondly, it at least sets a baseline that can be negotiated, between the two parties. Right now, what's the baseline? It's 0 or 100%, so we need to get something on the books.
John, can I just step in one thing? So, you're right, so one of the things I just want to clear up is that the town is not negotiating anything right now. What I think we're talking about is the site plan that's currently under review under the current ARDA standards. So if they meet those standards, then it's a site plan approved and approved administratively. Now, the question becomes, the town is looking at potentially with the current site plan, looking at similar to what Seabrook did in regards to some construction requirements, but there's nothing negotiating. I think the other third part was that potentially there was a PDD discussion, but I don't know where that stands.
Okay,
But right now, it's kind of like three pots.
In communication, unless I misread it, in the communication just last Friday or so.
Right,
It
correct.
said that there was a dual path going on.
Well, there's actually three, and it was not really even three. So based on the communication that went out, it was talking about a potential PDD. That has not been submitted to Planning Commission. If that comes through, that will come through you all as a rezoning of those parcels. The current actual dual track right now is just a site plan that's under review. And then, of course, you all talking about making rezoning recommendations with regards to those parcels on Beach Walker.
But I assume that
PDD, Plan Development District.
PDD. I understand, but I'm suggesting that it's in play anyway. It may not be.
It may not be in play. That's just really right now very preliminary. If they decide to move that forward, that can be end of this year, that can be next year, because it's a rezoning process that has to go through the process of public clearing, planning commission, and ultimately to council.
But regardless, the fact remains, we'll be on firmer ground as a town if we rezone that property.
Yes, if all the parcels on Beach Walker, at some point, those need to be proactively, those need to be, some sort of zoning designation need to be, hopefully be recommended from you all to council for those parcels.
Really creating the zones, they don't exist, there's nothing to revert to, so
Right.
we need to look at when the development agreement expires December 3rd, what are those properties? If we do nothing, there's nothing there and we could be in trouble. So we want to decide what is appropriate zoning for those parcels.
That's correct. That is the one thing. That's correct. That's the one thing. But then also to understand, I don't want to complicate this, but also to understand from the community standpoint that the current site plan that is currently under review, if for some reason it's approved, then it kind of freezes whatever that zoning is. But yes, you all are working on exactly what you said, Ms. Hennessy.
Ms. Kay, I wanted to just add a couple more things that you, and your last question about legal implications and standards. So we talked about a few of those. One of the things, and I just kind of went back to my notes here, is this idea of non-conforming structures. Then as part of this process, some of these parcels have been developed or in the process of being developed. And so whatever zoning decisions that are made out of this, there potentially would be non-conforming structures in place. One of the things that for Kiowa is long history of associated development in the late 70s, early 80s, a number of projects that we see that go before the Board of Zoning Appeals based on when our zoning code came into place, creating non-conforming structures. And so as part of that, that's one of those things to consider. I just wanted to add that in to when I look back at those legal types of questions. Are there any other, Mr. Carr?
You know, being aware of some of the community's input, you know, there's been a suggestion that there would be an engineer evaluate the properties to see basically what the properties can handle from a stormwater and ecological evaluation. Again, should that be done before we make these zoning recommendations?
So I want to just clear, like, those are two different things here. The request that is before you today is looking at the rezoning of these parcels. So particular review processes, if there is a request from this commission to change or administer amendments to our current review procedures, that's different. But this particular request is looking at how we rezone those properties. So how we might formalize, so I'll backtrack a little bit. The rezoning of these parcels is not for one particular development. It's looking at what the entire standards would be for that site. Hopefully that kind of addresses it.
And again, I know you want me to leave, don't you?
No.
Just to specifically answer your question, in regards to what was discussed yesterday, really had to do with the site plan that's currently under review, not what y'all are doing today. And the town is potentially looking at, I talked with John, we are looking at bringing in someone to look at in regards to the site plan process, not what you guys are doing. So that's kind of what was discussed yesterday was in regards to specifically what's going on right now under the current site plan review.
Yeah, those are
Those
questions I
parcels.
can't speak to, so she can speak to those types of things, so yes, yeah. Are there other questions before we get into the weeds a little bit? Okay, so remember, this is a workshop. What I'm gonna do is revert back to that big spreadsheet, and through this discussion, we'll have a discussion. And like I said, there's no action being taken today on any of these, but as from a process standpoint, I do want to hear from you all, and I do want to, after you guys have had some discussion, there's an additional public comment period, and so to hear from people from the public as well, and then we'll continue to massage it accordingly until you feel comfortable making a recommendation to council. But if you all want to go to that big spreadsheet.
John, I have one question about the spreadsheet.
Yes.
Are we to, we are not, even though you've got it on the spreadsheet, parcels 13, Cape, all these others, are we to assume that we are going to separate that out and take a look at making a recommendation on that rezoning this afternoon? I'm just trying to understand, what are we?
So what I did was pull out all of the ones that we had some comments relatively to what I'm gonna use the word squishiness or concern. And so these are pretty much, I'm gonna go through these. Beachwalker, Upper Beachwalker, which has parcel 8, 9, 10, 11, and the former church parcel, which is not part of the development agreement, but I do wanna speak to that once we get into it. And then parcel 13, which is down in Lower Beachwalker, and parcel 12, which is associated with Beachwalker Park, as well as Captain Sam's. And so those are all of the ones that, yes, I want you guys to make some comments to.
Okay, even though we're going to address that this afternoon, because
So we're not gonna, if the question is, after we talked this morning, are we gonna make a recommendation this afternoon? That's not my intention for us to make a recommendation this afternoon on these that have been provided.
but you're suggesting that we're going to separate them at some point in time.
Yes.
And it'll come forward as an individual agenda item as opposed to all of them together.
I would prefer that they come all together. If you guys get to a point where you want to move one of
Understand
them
your point.
forward,
Understand
that's
your
fine, but it makes that thing easier to do them all together.
Okay.
So where I am going to start is, and this might be hard for those of you sitting in the audience to see, but I'm going to try my best to pull that up. This has been posted online as well. So yeah, this is very hard to see here. But what I want to do is at least go through this working document. And if there's, like I said, questions, stop me along the way. But the purpose of this, this goes back to some of the questions raised at our previous workshop. What are standards today? What's being recommended? for each of those zoning standards. So in this, I'm going to walk through exactly what you see here. The first column is a specific parcel that has been identified, and that's based on the Development Agreement 13.2 exhibit. So some of these are actual specific parcels, and then some of these are actual let me clarify how I use this, actual subdivided parcels based on a subdivision process. Specifically just two areas, parcel 8 and 10. You can see in one of the handouts that I gave you, that's essentially two parcels on one official parcel. So there's not an official separate TMS for parcel 8 and a separate TMS number for parcel 10. And so I just wanted to make that clarity to you. So we have the future land use category, the zoning standards, the building height, as well as dwelling units per acre and dwelling units per building.
On
Yes.
current standard 2013 ARDA, can we assume that's what's being reviewed on the site plan right now?
Yes.
Okay, so in the site plan right now, I just wanted to, so I get my baseline score in my own mind. Does the current proposed plat or preliminary plat have residential properties on lot 8?
So Lot 8 is not part of what's been submitted for under site plan review. Okay.
So what has been submitted in the I guess we can call it up, but I don't have it here.
So,
What's submitted in the
yeah,
preliminary plat?
so for what's been submitted for site plan review today is parcel 11 and the former church parcel.
That's it.
Correct.
So that's the only properties that's being evaluated in the
Yes.
preliminary plat.
For Upper Beachwalker, I'm
I'm
sorry,
sorry,
yeah,
yeah, I
just for
understand.
Upper Beachwalker.
Okay.
And John, have they officially been combined, or are they still separate parcels today?
These are separate parcels. There's not been a combination of these parcels. So that's the first column there in the white there that shows the actual parcels that are identified within our 2013 amended and restated development agreement. That next column that Mr. Iwan just referenced, the current standards of the ARDA, that's what the development agreement has in it today. The next column would be our zoning ordinance, and the final two columns that are in blue, shades of blue, are recommendations based on the first initial column is what was presented at last workshop, and then what's been revised is based on some of the feedback shared at our last workshop for some of the standards there.
For practical purposes, can we ignore the first blue column?
I don't want you to, but you
Yeah,
can.
we can. It's irrelevant at this point, and it makes it easier for us to see if we should take it out.
But I really just wanted to be able to show you the two, so you see that what's been changed. So that there are some things that have been changed that I would have not felt comfortable changing, but I do want to at least have you seen what those things are. Hopefully that answers your question. So let's start with parcel 8. This is the Parkway Gate. If you see your handouts, you can see exactly where that is. This is the corner that is adjacent to the rear of the general store, adjacent to the Key Island Parkway. That's a commercial designation. When I showed you the zoning map earlier, you can see that parcel 8, oops. I'm gonna try to pull up, why it's not letting me zoom in. Just to the right of the red, as Mr. Dowdy shared. It's just that area. So that, as I mentioned, this is not a separate TMS number from parcel 10, but those two have been within our development agreement overlaid areas for So this area where my cursor is here, that would be parcel 8. This lower part where the lagoon is would be parcel 10. And so those are not distinctive, separate TMS numbers, but one. So that area that you see, Parkway Gate, is identified. Beachwalker Office Park, which is parcel 9, that's the area just below the general store, this area. I just mentioned parcel 10, which is this area. And then Beachwalker Lagoon, which represents parcel 11. This area here, this former church parcel, is the flag lot here that's skinny at the top and then a flag at the bottom here. That's the former church parcel. I shared with you all some exhibits. I know that was an additional question that was raised of what are the, well, how that property came about, essentially being a former church parcel. And so as part of today, I just wanted to reiterate that that particular parcel, as it's shown today on our zoning map, being R3/C, was rezoned in 2016. And that was in 2016, formerly being community support. And so continuing, I think I'll pause there because those are all the upper parcels. So I'll pause at the upper just for a moment. Question for you, Mrs. Kay?
You said the church lot was rezoned in 2016? And
Yes.
it was community support. What is it now?
That's based on the ordinance that was written in 2016. That parcel designated, as R3/C based on the ordinance that was written. So we come to the proposed zoning standards that are outlined. As I started today's conversation, these are recommendations based on a number of factors that have been considered. And so what you see for these upper Beachwalker parcels being recommended to go to what's been identified as Beachwalker 1 zoning district. And so these have standards that have been outlined. You see what was proposed at our previous workshop, and you see what's in the current revisions that have been made. To Mr. Iwan's point, I'll try to focus on that right column. So one of the things that you see here is the height standards for Beachwalker 1. And this might be a good time for you guys to look at the actual exhibit standards for the proposed zoning district, and you can kind of see those in the zoning standards, the draft documents.
I think,
Yeah, you won't have any, you're looking at what we're looking at.
You're bouncing back and forth, and then that has to
Yeah.
bounce back and forth at the same time.
Bill, I think you're going, let me just.
I'll continue to reference which documents that are beyond here.
That would be helpful.
With all due respect, I would recommend that, are we going to have a opportunity for the public to say, okay?
Absolutely.
So because what happened last time, when we let them interrupt the process, it
Yeah.
really, so if you guys would hold your comments till the end, and you'll get your opportunity then.
Thank you.
So this is,
That's good.
there might have been, there were some extras outside, so if they're, maybe didn't run enough of those, but this is the proposed Beachwalker 1 designation zoning standards. As I mentioned last time, the framework of this is established from our existing standards, so not a whole lot have been modified from our existing R3, R3, R2 residential standards, R1 residential standards, and our C commercial standards. The framework comes from existing zoning standards in place. Here, you can see that the maximum density for this district is 12 dwelling units per acre, and there should be no more than 4 dwelling units per acre within this district. That's a change from the previous proposal where there were 7 dwelling units per building. And so you see here, the biggest change here is in that multifamily category, where you see that 2.5 stories, 40 feet in building height is what was changed. Previously, there was a 3 stories, 45 feet, and the difference really being 2.5 stories versus 3 stories. Staff's recommendation previously was that this is really just building out that half story to its full area and 5 additional feet for height and feet standards. That's essentially the biggest change from the Beachwalker 1 standards. Still in place, or accessory structure should be located a minimum of 20 feet from the rear of the property. And then what I want to do is essentially go to section 102, which is the principal use and standards, principal use and use regulations. And you can see here that within Beachwalker 1, what would be permitted from a use standard, from a use allowance. And just a reminder from our previous conversation, if you see a P in that column, that represents a permitted use. If you see a C, that's a conditional use. Both of those are administrative approvals, meaning that those can be done without a public hearing process. The C just means a little bit more heightened scrutiny, meaning certain conditions need to be met by the property owner, the applicant, prior to being approved. And that final one is if you see a S in that category, that means special exception. That special exception is a process where it would require a Board of Zoning Appeals approval. If that column, that cell is blank, that means it's not a permitted use. So I'm gonna keep my cursor here. You can see we're gonna roll down for this, staying at Beachwalker 1. When we look at residential, everything from single family to multifamily between would be permitted. Historical sites are conditional use. Community recreation would be a conditional use. Parks, a permitted use. Sewage pumping control stations is a special exception. Sewage collection and electric, gas, and power distribution are conditional uses. And then special exception for restaurants associated with both types there, both with and without alcohol beverage would be a special exception process. So that would require approval from the Board of Zoning Appeals, which is a different change. What would also be a permitted use are real estate sales services, essentially administrative business offices. And that's really the bulk of the standards, the uses that would be allowed in this BW1. This can be amended at any time. So if there was something that recommendation come forth that, hey, we want to add in, I don't know, a souvenir store or one of these things here for that particular use category, that can always be amended.
John, a couple of questions.
Yes.
One is, in the current ARDA standards and the current land use, it was commercial. Why are we suggesting that we move away from commercial if we're considering historical standards and adding all this residential exposure behind a current commercial piece of property?
Can you repeat? I'm sorry. Can you repeat that one more time?
Yes, so in the current ARDA standards and the current land use planning and zoning ordinance, it's land use and zoning is commercial. So I'm just trying to understand your logic, why you're proposing mixed use and detailing all the residential exposure when historically it's been commercial with no residential exposure.
So this is one of the things I want to call out. You're looking at specifically just that parcel 8 which is not an official separate TMS number. So this particular category would be applied to both 8 and 10. And so not to have a separate commercial recommendation for that entire parcel, that's the recommendation of BW1, because there is not a separation between parcel 8 and parcel 10.
So,
So you're looking at parcel 10 to be, that's why you're picking up residential?
Correct.
Okay, and as I understand it from the meetings before with Mr. Bramar, lot 10 is not really economically developable in terms of residential because of the size and the setbacks.
So I want to share again, lot 10 is not a separate parcel.
Yep.
So when we look at, let me go pull this area here. So this, what's been highlighted is,
So the same question goes for 8 and 10, or 8 or 10, or why are you proposing residential when A, it's not developable, and B, the history is commercial?
so I have never made a recommendation that this parcel is undevelopable. And I want to be clear that this parcel can be developed. There are two essential points that I made at the last meeting, that in order for these parcels to be developed, number one, its current access point is adjacent to the Kiawah Island Parkway behind the main gate.
That's not really the focus of my question, though.
Okay,
Whether
so-
it can or cannot be.
Okay,
I'm just
I'm
stating
sorry.
it cannot be, based on what Mr. Pamar said economically. So you can throw that out, it was just a comment, but if it was historically zoned parcel 8, that portion of it, why would you recommend changing that from, if we're using kind of history as a
So,
guide?
Luke, I think the reason why, if you look on the back, the reason why is because it is not two separate parcels. It really is one. So when we're looking at really creating a zoning classification, we have to look at both 8 and 10 because the county does not separate it. Only the ARDA created the two separate parcels. So we either have to pick one or the other. So your question, so what John was doing was saying, okay, that really is one parcel that's zoned for residential and for commercial. So that's the reason why he made that recommendation. But ultimately, you all can say, we understand it's one parcel, but we want to keep it either all commercial or all residential, or go based on a recommendation.
So-
That's the reason why he did that.
And I think, I agree with that. I see his point, and I understand 8 and 10 are officially one parcel.
That's correct.
The Kiawah Island Parkway access is moot because of what we did last October by approving, as I remember our meeting, we approved access through Beachwalker to access parcel 8, and all thought of using Kiawah Island Parkway went away. So that's not an issue. Parcel 8 is commercial. Parcel 10, for those of us who walked it, is really, it's by Cougar. It's, you know, you'd have to build a bridge. There are a lot of things you'd have to do to develop it. And so I think Luke's point is good. You know, why not leave this commercial rather than open it up to residential?
So, no, I was going to say, once we get to making a recommendation, if the commission wants to recommend that go to commercial, that is in the wheelhouse of what we're doing today. So what I'm doing is just sharing where we are as far as a procedure standpoint. But once we begin to actually apply what you might see as the best uses or allowances, you can recommend that parcel go to commercial.
You know,
In the ZLDR, it's either or, and I think that's our precedent. I think we should follow that it's either residential or commercial. We don't have mixed use, and I haven't seen yet the need to create a mixed use.
I mean, looking at these parcels collectively, these are 8 and 10, or the one, these are the ones that you wouldn't want developed. I mean, so as a property owner or just a Kiawah resident, I mean, these are the ones that you prefer to see stay non-developed.
The downside of that is, of course, you know what you're going to get if you go mixed use. Do you know what you're going to get if you go commercial? I mean, commercial could drive as much traffic as yeah.
And
Kiawah Island Parkway, visually,
Sure.
forests to the golf course, I mean, these are the two property, 8 and 10, that you would prefer to see stay as is.
so I do want to raise something that was just shared by Mr. Dowdy. So as this process, if commercial is recommended for this parcel, that is a different category within our zoning standards that allows for a number of uses that staff feel would be compatible to allowing in that particular area. And so here I have the current standards here that would say all of these things would be recommended to be able to be on that parcel from a use standpoint. And so when you change to our current commercial designation, that allows for a wider range of uses for that parcel. So I just want you all to be aware, if that is a recommendation that comes forth, if you recommend that this goes to commercial, for example, this column where we are now, you can see my cursor, historical sites, libraries, museums, nature gardens, post office, recreation camps, vehicle storage, all of these things would be into play because this is a definitely more intense category from staff's perspective, where it's, in my opinion, less intensity than the mixed-use development BW1 that's being proposed. So I just wanted to make sure that you're aware of that.
John, treating parcel 8 and parcel 10 as one lot, when you have, you've got a footnote on parcel 10 that says there's a 6 units per acre, but you indicate there's only 4 total units. Is that 4 total units on 10, or does that include what can be built on 8 and, so 4 units on 8 and 10, or 4 units on 10 only?
So this would apply to that entire parcel, not separately.
Okay,
So there would be,
So between 8 and 10, they'd be limited to 4 units at 6, so there'd be 24, basically 24 unit front doors that could be built.
if you're measuring what the acreage is time the buildings or the
Well, I'm
actual
seeing
density?
You got in parentheses, you've got 6 DUs per acre, 4 total units.
So the four units is the number of dwelling units that can be within a building. So that isn't that's the maximum number of dwelling units per building on a site.
Okay, but then you got below, then you got 6 DUs per building, so.
I'm gonna come to you real quick.
Looking at the far right-hand column.
No, I'm saying he's got 6 units, you got 4. I thought that assumed that they only would, because of.
Okay, gotcha. All right, I was looking at the wrong column there. So that is within the current development agreement allowances. So for that particular parcel, yes, the entitlements for that parcel are 4 units.
Okay, and is that, and would that include, okay, I got.
That would have been just for parcel 10.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, but then looking at your proposed zoning changes, treating 8 and 10 as one unit, you've got a footnote, or you note on number, you've got 12 DUs, 4 DUs, so is that, because you're treating it as one, in the proposed zoning, is there 48 units between the combined unit, or are there 96 between the combined?
It would just be based on what could be developed on a site based on the acreage. So if we're looking just hypothetically at this particular parcel, majority of that parcel does have the lagoon there. So ideally, the amount of developable lands won't marry exactly over to what you probably could max out on this parcel.
Okay, I got it. So we would need to know the buildable acreage before we could figure out how many units are involved.
I mean, that can be in your consideration, looking at the acreage of each of these parcels when you make your recommendation. I mean, that you can look at the acreage of each of these, but for the process, I don't want you to just focus on that one standard. There's a number of standards that are associated with so.
But when I'm just trying to decode your footnotes here, but is that total acreage or buildable acreage?
That would be the total acreage.
Okay, so the total acreage, so they could, if they could squeeze it in, they could do 12 units per acre over the total number of acres.
But it would be a max of 4 dwelling units per building. And so
Yeah,
the,
would be the number of buildings they put up times 4.
right. So I meant if that's feasible from the setbacks, all those different, height,
Yeah,
all of
okay,
those types of
okay.
things, yeah.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
So I like that you lowered the stories and the height from the last proposed zoning. But my question is these were R2 originally. And in R2, you could have duplexes, but no multifamily dwellings. And now, in the new Beachwalker 1, you've included multifamily. Why did you include multifamily for BW1 when it wasn't part of R2?
So BW1 was looking at not just one particular parcel, right? So I'm looking at that entire area and how that potentially could play out. All of those factors that I mentioned at the beginning were part of me choosing that recommendation of allowing multifamily in that area. Like I said, if you all want to say maybe BW1 does not allow multifamily and it's only duplexes and townhomes, single family, that's an option. It's just those things, you want to just be mindful of all of those factors that I mentioned, what would be allowed today versus what could be in the future.
I would suggest that instead of creating BW1, which is totally new zoning, I don't know that we need to do that. Why not look at our existing zoning codes and decide which ones are applicable to each lot? Like I agree with what Ron said, R2 does not allow multifamily, so maybe we don't want to do that upzone. Why don't we look at each parcel and decide, rather than trying to create a homogeneous zone for all of them, which may not be in the best interest of the community, why not use our current zoning codes and say, okay, we want to apply R2 to this one or R3 to that one?
So there,
And use the standards that are already written, and they're not mixed use. And I think that would be to the communities, I think that would answer some of the questions of the community that we've gotten, that we don't want approved mixed use. And down the road, if the developer comes to us with a PD that makes sense to everybody, we can approve it. But I don't think we want to preemptively do the mixed use, because then we kind of lose control.
you guys have the opportunity to make any recommendation that you want. What I'm sharing is staff's recommendation and some of the things that I think you should consider and some of those implications. So because of that, knowing that those properties have had commercial and residential opportunities on them since the existing, that doesn't mean they have to move forward, but I think that was part of the recommendation of considering all of the conditions, looking at the location of these parcels, and best practices of land use patterns. That's part of staff's recommendation. So at any point, once we get to where you guys' comfortability is, that's on you guys to make that recommendation of whatever standard that would be applied to these parcels.
Yeah, I think I like Joanne's idea of either us deciding now and being flexible in the future if the developer wanted to change it, or I don't suggest we do this, but we could go to the developer and say, which one do you want? Do you want commercial or do you want R2? And then proceed that way. I'm not excited about creating a mixed-use category either. It just opens up, it's inconsistent with what we've been doing since we've created the new zoning codes. And I'd like to stay consistent with that history as we've talked.
Let me ask a question. Do we have any properties that are mixed use right now? I mean, the presumption is that we don't have any properties that are mixed use.
We do.
We do. That's what
Yes.
I thought. Like what are they called? The place down at the ocean that everybody. Timber. Well, not even the Timbers. The one that the Cape. Doesn't have that's got a mixed use.
Correct.
Okay, so we do have, I just want to be clear, we do have mixed-use properties.
John, you said going forward, the new zoning approach is not to have mixed use, or not to have dual codes, just to have one code.
Yeah.
But you said that last week?
So the amended and reset development agreement dual zoning is one of those things that we wanted to correct in moving forward. The idea of what mixed use is, I think still can be, of how that was applied within the development agreement can still be applied to these parcels as well. It just needs to be written into the standard. So if you guys have the thought to say, well, we want the property owner to be able to still choose commercial or residential, you guys can write that into the standard that, hey, it's an option of, we just want that to be clear that this is the base zoning district that would choose either how you develop that property. So that would just be a line that we would need to add in as far as the standard would be. Yeah.
I think, Larry, on your point, the Cape, you know, there is mixed use that was permitted under the ARDA. There is no mixed use in our ZLDR. And so the question is, do we want to stick with the ZLDR once the ARDA expires? And I think that's what we're saying is, okay, these things were okay in the development agreement. We had to allow more things to be developed, and it was an agreement between the town and the developer, and that's fine. But that's expiring. Going forward, to protect the town, let's revert to the R2, R3 designations, and then if a specific proposal comes to us that makes sense for us to expand that, we can do that at that time.
So
Let me-
can I, oh, I'm sorry.
I just want to understand, so what you're proposing is that we have R2C now, and they have to choose R2 or C.
Or we should choose.
Well, let me ask, R2 or C. So what you're proposing is that we should eliminate C or, I'm trying to understand, would it be an R2 that then the developer or whoever's developing it would have to come to and say, hey, I want to do some commercial there, can I change it to? So we would go back to and have to change zoning on specific plats to C, as opposed to having them just opt which one at that time.
I'd have to think about it. I hadn't thought about asking, you know, one of the reasons that John told us we were doing this is we had to clean up the zoning map because our codes do not allow dual zoning. So I was thinking we'd go one way or the other. If, per what Luke said, we give the owner the option of one or the other, I haven't thought about that
Okay,
yet.
but my purpose of asking the question is that if we used what John's proposing, what do we call them?
Mixed use.
Mixed-use zoning, and then mixed-use zoning, and in the zoning regulations, we say, but that means you have to go one way or the other way. So, you know, what's the difference between that and what we've got now, which is R2/C? If we put an M there instead and say, well, I want to be commercial, then they have to go 100% commercial.
And that's critical because R2/C means residential and commercial. Not
No,
either
it mean-
or.
No, but they got to select.
In
So-
ARDA, it
so-
means or.
so one of the things-
Specifically outlined that it's
I-
or.
Can I come back to just, I think, the word mixed use and what that really means? Simply what it is, it's a mix of uses. You can have, opposed to just a standard residential category of only residential, that mixed use category allows for, it can be set up anyway. So it can be those things that would be in a PR category, a other limited commercial category, but it's really just the idea that you're allowing an additional to whatever, in my mind, whatever that you want as a true base district. So staff's recommendation is really that these are reflected of more residential zoning districts, but with the idea that there's limited commercial that could be added to these particular parcels.
John, do we already have a mixed-use category? It won't apply to this particular area, but we already have a mixed-use category in our zoning code, which is PROC.
PROC is a mixed-use category, which
So
allows.
We do have mixed use, that's what I'm
Yes,
saying.
correct.
We do have that we do have
Correct.
mixed use.
But not residential.
But we would
They're
need,
not on this particular property.
won't
but
we
do have mixed
need
use.
to have a BW1 or BW2? Because we already have the Cape that needs that designation. I mean,
Not necessarily.
So that was my point of, if there is an application to change, not change, but apply zoning district or standards that are significantly different from how those properties have been developed, you are creating essentially a non-conforming structure. And so that would be one of those things that I mentioned as part of those considerations of creating a bunch of non-conforming structures.
We'll get to BW2, that's different.
No, but I'm just saying, we can't just use those old zoning codes.
Yeah, we can on BW1.
Yeah.
We don't, but that's not BW1, that's BW2, so we haven't gotten to that. But on BW1, I hear what you're saying, John, but I think based on the community input, we would rather it be zoned one way and come to us or BZA for a special exception. If there's a commercial thing that wanted to be added, then the community would have a chance to say, no, we don't want a McDonald's, or yes, we do want a little ice cream shop or coffee shop, or whatever the developer wants to do. But I would rather it be a proactive approval of a specific thing rather than a blanket zoning change, because then we can't control it.
I agree with that. I mean, what we don't want to have happen is have a mixed-use zoning in a neighborhood and have somebody say, I'm going to build a, coffee shop in the preserve or whatever, if that. And so we prevent that now by having he's got to choose whether it's R2 or whatever the residential or C or commercial. But I think that what we're trying to get to is how do we prevent broad application of mixed use in an area that we don't want it to happen in a residential area? And we'd have to put some control, whatever we use, into it.
So I'll just share, two things. I think you're taking the approach of it being a wholesale package of saying we have to have BW1 or not. And I think what I'm recommending is if there are things that you want to change from a standard perspective, you can alter those standards in that zoning district. So if there's something from or it can just be, hey, R2, R3, whatever those things are. What I'm saying is I don't want you guys to get so tunnel vision of where it's just BW1 and nothing else when you're look at the actual standards and uses allowed. That's what zoning is about, looking at the specific standards and the specific uses that would be allowed. And so staff recommendation, it utilized the existing standards from those categories that are already in our zoning code. So there isn't significant different. The other thing that I'll quickly share, and I love the discussion. This is what the workshop was created to do here. This is that future land use map. So to your point, Luke, it does follow, I probably should pull this up. Daniel, you just shared this one? Yep. It does share that these parcels were identified as mixed use in our current future land use map. And so that's part of the considerations of why you see that this red area where it was parsed out based on it being two different parcels in the development agreement. That doesn't mean that has to happen for this. So you would be assigning, again, not just the zoning, but the future land use designation as well. So I want you to also keep that in mind, that you will be assigning a future land use category to these parcels.
In that case, parcel 8 is commercial. And parcel 10 is residential and mixed use, right?
Yeah.
Am I seeing that right?
So when this map is revised, we will see one color opposed to two colors, is what I'm saying, yeah.
You don't happen to have the dimensions on 8 or 10, do you, Andy?
We can pull the plat, but if,
I'm talking about the 30 by 40 or.
we have plats for that, but I wouldn't do it part of this process right now, but yeah, we can have that information.
Okay. Yeah, but I'm okay changing the future land use.
You guys need a break, or?
Sure.
I think we'll take a 5-minute break.
Okay. We'll take 5.
Quick question while
Sure.
we're waiting for Larry before you go. So or is it just a height issue?
It's above BBHE, which is our base building height elevation. So it varies from area to area.
So if the building height elevation is 10 feet, it's 2.5 stories above 10 feet,
Or above whatever.
whatever the flood level designation is. So it's 2.5 above parking, because you could probably park above it. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
So, are we back, Aaron? Aaron, are we back?
That chart there, is that one of the handouts? 'Cause I'm not.
Okay, we are live back. So, where we left off is essentially Beach Walker 1. What I'm going to do is, like I said, we aren't taking any action today, but I do think I want to at least gain some understanding and maybe based on today's workshop, after we've had some discussion, be able to prepare official documents for our next time together. That way you can understand what all of those standards are. If there's things that that's being recommended today as far as recommendations, feel free to share those things, and that way we can begin to build the documentation that will reflect that. I've been hearing questions about height just a moment ago. I've been hearing questions about R2 just going to the base zoning in our current code of R2. So what I'm doing is I've shared staff's recommendation, and so I'm leaning down on you all to kind of share your thoughts and excuse me, perspectives on what might these parcels be. Let's do this. Let's shift to Lower Beach Walker. That way we can have at least some discussion regarding Lower Beach Walker. I do want to make sure that we know we have a hard stop for this afternoon. So based on this, I think maybe around 11:30 we can stop to allow for the public to be able to share as part of this workshop as well. And so if we shift to Lower Beach Walker, we can discuss those particular standards because staff's recommendation is essentially a different zoning designation in BW2. Is that cool, Mr. Chair? All right. So, let me go back up. So within the Lower Beach Walker, there are essentially two distinct areas. One is the parent parcel 13 that's in the development agreement 13.2 exhibit, and the other is parcel 12. These have been broken out, and you can see A, B, and C, and then A and B. Similarly, for parcel 12, I want to make a distinction that there is an area that is not a true defined parcel by TMS number. So I'll make that distinction. And then I think most of us are familiar with parcel 13. This commission has had a lot of work, maybe not for the newer members, but dealing with parcel 13 and knowing the location. This includes Timbers, the current site of the Cape, and Lot 1, which is across the street from those two areas. So what currently is allowed based in our development agreement, this is the future land use designation of mixed use, which the zoning standards matter to R3C. This is 4 stories, 65 feet in height, and 12 dwelling units per acre. The unique thing about this particular area, and I'm focusing right now just on Lot 1, that you all seen in the timeline history of the 2013 amended and restated development agreement that some amendments were made. And so one of those amendments were made specifically but 2 of those amendments were made specifically for parcels under that parent tract of parcel 13. One of those is Lot 1, which was the most recent, and that created a limited height zone for areas to be 3 stories and 55 feet in height. And that area is adjacent to the cottage owners, the pool down adjacent to Duneside. This also modified the standards regarding the number of dwelling units per building. So whereas the principal standard is 7 dwelling units per building, this particular was modified for this site, Lot 1, so that 2 of those buildings could be no more than 14 dwelling units per building, and then 2 of those can be no more than 10, and the remainder of those can be no more than 8 dwelling units per building. And similarly, looking down to where the Cape is, a second amendment to the development agreement, which occurred prior to Lot 1's amendment, did a similar thing where there's look really site-specific at the height standards. And so there was a limited height zone, A and B, created for those areas. The central, if you're looking at the Cape, is really that central area where the proposed club facilities are, and then the adjacent areas flanking towards the beach side, towards Timbers. And so those areas are lower height standards, are 25 and 35 respectively. The additional, similarly to Lot 1, there's a varied dwelling unit per building amendment that was approved by council, and that allowed for up to 2 of those buildings to allow 20 dwelling units per building, and then 2 of those to allow up to 12, and then the remainder to be not more than 8 dwelling units per building. Timbers was the only one that did not have any of those amendments in place, so it followed that sort of base category there of mixed use, 4 stories in height, 65 feet height limit, 12 dwelling units per acre, and 7 dwelling units per building. Each of those Timbers buildings have 7 units. So we come to the recommendations of staff for these particular parcels. We're looking at, and I'm going to stop just on parcel 13, and then I'll jump to parcel 12. These are Beachwalker 2. For Lot 1, the future land use destination is being recommended to high-density residential, opposed to mixed use, and the height standards you can see shifting from our previous time together. The number of dwelling units per building shifted from 10 to 7. That 10 was looking at the existing standards and looking at sort of a medium of where those allowances are today. That 7 drops back down to what the current allowances are. And then the height in stories and feet, you can see, has shifted from previously 4 stories with a 55 feet max to 3 stories of 50 feet. There is one additional detail that structures within 30 feet of any property line may not exceed 40 feet in height. And so that's been carried over in staff's recommendation that those structures that have been proposed within 30 feet of any property line, that those would not exceed 40 feet in height.
John, just for my this is, are we talking about Timbers lot that was developed? Lot 1, is that the Timbers?
Lot 1 is the undeveloped parcel. Yeah,
Okay. That's on the other side of the road from the Timbers.
correct. Yeah.
How many acres is Lot 1?
I don't have that off the top of my head there. Yeah. When we look at parcel 12, I'm going to pull up the zoning map for these parcels as well as a future land use destination so you can see these. But as mentioned earlier in the upper Beachwalker discussion of parcel 8 and 10, this has a similar application of where it's not a unique parcel. And so staff's recommendation is looking at an entire parcel that's been carved up by the subdivision process. And so, sorry, did it again. Here's our zoning map. You can see here where Lower Beach Walker parcels are. So just for a frame of reference, I want everyone to understand where we are. Everyone can see the timbers. This is all falling in parcel 13, parent tract timbers. Beach Walker Ocean is the official name of the parcel 13, but that is reflective is where the Cape is being developed today. Lot 1, that was just referenced by Mr. Iwan, is across Southern Pines to the north. So those 3 parcels collectively represent parcel 13 from the parent tract based on the development agreement.
Down in lot 1, is that purple color part of lot 1, or is that something else?
That is not part of lot 1. So that's where the area pool is, down inside the cottage, owners.
And then what's the rectangular between Timbers and Duneside Villa?
That's Duneside 2.
Oh, is that too? Okay, thank you.
Lot 1, parcel 13 is proposed to be Ocean Pines development.
Correct. That's where Ocean Pines proposal is for lot 1.
And so far we've heard that's luxury condominiums, is that correct?
Yes, multifamily. Yes.
John, as I recall, when we did the zoning work on Timbers, the developer presented conceptual, what he was going to do on, well, which is now going to be Ocean Pines. Is this, any of these reflect that conceptual? One of the things we were working on was access, traffic access, and we wanted, that was part of what we were asking as to how the access road was gonna come from,
Right.
traffic flow, that kind of stuff.
So you're asking if this zoning standards has considerations from based on that conceptual plan? My short answer is yes, because that plan has been, I've seen iterations of that. My short answer is yes. I don't want to say the initial concept plan is that was proposed for that, but I would say yes to your question.
It's not materially changed.
Yeah, you're correct, yeah.
John, I'm sorry for all the questions.
No, this,
Is there any parking requirement in the zoning? Like is, R3, does that require a certain number of parking spots per development unit, or?
not based on the category, but based on the use. So R1 doesn't have a different standard than R3. It's just based on the use of that. R1 has a different use than R3, but those parking standards would align to the actual use of the property.
Are they per development unit, or what's?
So they would be per how those developments, so some of it is based on number of units per building, some is based on square footage. So those vary based on how those properties are developed.
So that was included in the site plan,
Yeah. I didn't know if that was in zoning, is my question, so.
So it's part of the zoning code, it's just not within the actual zoning district category. It's another section in our zoning code.
Thank you.
So
And for Ocean Pines, what's the status? Is that site plan has been,
site plan has not been approved for that project, it's still under site plan review.
okay, thanks.
John, I have a question similar to what we talked about in PW1. Why do we need to create a whole new zoning district in PW2? When I look at what, why not revert again to R3, which is 2.5 stories, 40 feet, rather than 3 stories, 50 feet, 40 used per building rather than 7. The stuff that's built already, it'll become, as you say, non-conforming. That's not a problem. Anybody who's been involved with zoning in any previous municipalities know that as towns grow and change, land use patterns grow and change, and new rules are put into place. It has absolutely no effect on existing properties. We're not going to tell the Cape, oh, we changed the zone, you got to knock yourself down. No, it just becomes a non-conforming property, which is, in any other municipality, completely irrelevant. It's just that Kia was new, and we're just getting to the point where we're completely developed and maybe looking at some of these zoning things. So as the ARDA expires, why not revert again, like we talked about in Upper Beach Walker, to R2, R3? I don't see the need to create a whole new zoning code, mixed use with high density. I don't see the value to the community of creating these districts.
So a couple things here. Ms. Hennessy can make any recommendation Ms. Hennessy wants for any of these parcels. That's the first thing I'm gonna share. The second thing I'm gonna share is, go back to the initial slide that I shared beginning today. All of those things were part of staff's recommendations of why this BW2 is being proposed for these. So when you look at how the parcels are developed today, the location of these parcels, land use patterns, design flexibility, legal implications, all of those things that I kind of mentioned is why I'm recommending that this category B2 be proposed. If there's something specific within those things that the commission is uncomfortable with, hey, you can modify the standards within that. You can say, hey, we're only comfortable with what's in our current code. From my comments from staff is that our zoning code, one of the things that I mentioned, for lack of better words, is outdated. It really doesn't matter to a lot of the standards and from a design standpoint and use compatibility of what you see modern standards are. And so this provides some flexibility to do that. So that's just what my recommendation from staff is. I don't know if that answers the question specifically of why, but those are all of the things that were considered of why BW2 is being proposed.
And is it outdated because we don't have a mixed-use category? Is that the primary reason our zoning codes are outdated?
So that's one, the use, so the one thing is the use allowance. The other is just when you look at I call it a hybrid of or extreme. It's like a pegboard if you can either do A or B. So it's either A or B, and there's no sort of wiggle room. And so this allows some wiggle room, not a whole lot, but it allows some wiggle room in between. And so that's really what staff's proposal is, to allow some wiggle room so that you can have, from a design standpoint, have some flexibility on what's proposed on that site. From a practical standpoint, any design team is going to evaluate all of the standards, and if they're not in the bucket, to your point earlier, if they're not in the bucket of what they see as the highest and best use for that property, then they probably would make a recommended zoning change to allow some of those things flexibility. This just has some bare minimum flexibility built into it today.
And if that's to the,
Parts of parcel 13 that are already developed, is it fair to say that we aren't doing anything other than conforming the as-developed property to the new B2 or BW2 recommendation?
So when we look at timbers, I'm looking at now, for those who you are in the audience, I'm going to pull this up so you see as well. When we look at the timbers here, the current allowances are 4 stories, 65 feet. The recommendation previously was 4 stories, 55 feet, and then that's been now curtailed to 3 stories, 50 feet. That's a change from what's allowed today.
Is it as developed?
So what's been
To further restrict zoning on a property that's already developed?
so this would be further restriction based on the standards that are allowed today.
So what are you saying? If they come in and want to do something different, they have to apply for zoning change?
if they wanted to do something different, I mean, these properties have just been developed, so I wouldn't imagine they've come in tomorrow, but 30 years from today, when those properties want to be
As far as the Cape, Timbers, Beachwater Park, all of those properties.
Mr. Cripelli, I'm going to pause you. Can you turn your mic on? Just push a button down. Thank you.
So again, the Cape, Timbers, Beachwalker Park, we'll get to Captain Sam's in a minute, but those three are pretty much as developed now. And if they want to, at some future time, come in for a zoning change, it has to be approved. And they could presumably adopt the current BW2 zoning.
So those properties are developed today based on existing standards.
Right, exactly.
So once redevelopment comes into play, we're actually discussing what those standards would be based on redevelopment.
Right.
And so what's being proposed is this BW2 for that. Yeah.
And that would be 10, 20 years from now, whatever. As far as Captain Sam's, the only change you're proposing, not the only change, but the major change is to zone the entire property active recreation and open space.
No. So I didn't get to parcel 12 yet, but I could, since you raised that question now, I'll come back here. So here is parcel 12. The first one I want to reference is Beachwalker Park, which everyone knows where this is parking area to get into the county park. The second is parcel 12A. You can see outlined here, and then you have Captain Sam's. In the development agreement, 12A, it's not its own separate parcel. You can see the parcel boundaries are essentially includes where this identified as parcel 12A as well as Captain Sam's. So the recommendation that you see in your materials here is to go to R1. So that is the recommendation. The future land use category is being proposed as active recreation and open space. However, the actual zoning designation for that being recommended is R1.
If there is a proposal at some point to develop it, it would have to be under the new standard as opposed to the old, which is, at least in its appearance, is very much an improvement over the old zoning. And clearly, R1 would accommodate active recreation and open space. Which it did before.
So let me show the future land use map then. So this would be the current future land use map for this parcels, which this area in this light sandy color is that low density R1, low density residential that reflects an R1 category. And then this area being the mixed use zoning category. And so what's being recommended is that this go to R1. I said it again. From a zoning standpoint, this go to R1. From a future land use category standpoint, active recreation and open space.
Right. So essentially, what you're saying on those four, if you will, from the Cape, Timbers, Beachwalker Park, and Captain Sam's, is really no change now. It's as built, and then in the future, or as approved, and then in the future, if they want to change, there has to be a zoning change approved, and it goes through the regular process.
So our process, where we are today, is those properties that are developed are developed. In the future, if those properties want to be redeveloped, then those parcels would need to apply to whatever standards that we create, whether that's whatever the commission recommends. Yeah.
So, John, on your proposal for parcel 12A, Beachwalker Park, it's going, and under the ARDA, it's going from R3 commercial to Parks and Recreation, mixed-use Parks and Recreation. That sort of makes sense to me. under Captain Sam Spit, it's going to active recreation and open space, but its zoning is R1. Why wouldn't you zone that as parks and recreation also? Or tell me what your logic is there.
So, in its nutshell, we understand the nuance, the hurdle that it is to develop this particular property. However, being able to restrict that to parks and recreation would essentially eliminate any entitlement to be able to develop that property. And so the R1 recommendation would be able to retain some ability to develop those properties.
Okay, so we're just not taking any economic incentive away from, okay, I understand.
I want to go back to Andy's point. Article 13, lot 1.
Not talking about possible, I didn't get up
Oh,
there.
I thought you said that.
No. Cape, Tibbers, bottom 4. If I'm not mistaken, go back to your question about traffic. I think the entrance to that parcel 13, lot 1, is from Doonside.
So,
That was something, go ahead.
That was a major issue
Yes, it was.
with respect to
But I thought we only had an exit there, not an entrance.
so lot 1 there is,
Doonside.
so
Entrance to Doonside, you can only exit that way.
It's either, there's only one, yeah, but it's coming from, depends on what happens.
the current proposal that is for Ocean Pines is that lot 1 would be accessed from both Beachwalker and Southern Pines. A portion of those would be accessed from Southern Pines, a portion would be accessed from Beachwalker.
John, I want to go back again to, I don't see the need for BW2. For when those properties go to be developed in 10 or 20 years, let the people who are here then decide how they want them to be redeveloped. I think if we put a base zone, again, using our current zoning codes of R1, R2, R3, I know you say they're outdated, but I think they might be more what the community wants than a, quote, more modern designation. You use the term highest and best use. I know in previous zoning things, we talked about that a lot, and there were arguments that a golf course wasn't highest and best use because we need more residential on that property, and maybe our real estate tax assessment should affect that. You can do a lot of things with highest and best use. From our community standpoint, highest and best use might be open space. So I don't think we need to modernize our zoning codes to increase use and density if that is not what our community wants. So why not revert to the base zoning codes that we have, and then if there is a specific proposal for a lot that has not been developed that uses it differently, that proposal can come to us. And if it makes sense, if it's a planned development, if it's something that makes sense and is in the best interest of the community, we can apply it. But I don't think we should preemptively create a brand-new zoning code. I don't think that's in the interest of the community.
I won't repeat my earlier, still, but I hear you. Are there other questions or comments? We have reached 11:14, so we had tried to bucket 11:30 to kind of put a button for commissioner kind of comments or discussion.
Yeah, the only comment, just a sidebar conversation I had with a couple of the others, that
I'm conceptually in agreement with the requirement to filter any request for commercial to be able to approve that. So going back to the R3-C classification, I was asked, why would you want to have a separate BW classification that allows for mixed use? And my only logic in this stuff is that it's because you might, by using that, you can control the geography of it. If you made it R3/C, then any R3 anywhere on the island that's zoned R3, somebody could then make a request for for commercial use. And yes, that could be policed. But by making it in certain areas only, by designating them geographically, this is where if somebody wanted to do something commercial, we'd be listening. We're not gonna listen to it if it's gonna be in the preserve or someplace like that.
First question is that true? Is, if we have a mixed-use zone, does that then preclude somebody from coming in the future and saying, I want to do this small commercial project in this property?
Yeah, well, I assume that we would still have the controls that we.
You know, just like you would, no different than if you had R3-C, where somebody'd have to come to you, we'd have, and it has to go through an approval process. We would the same thing, I would use the same thing, but only having, why why don't you just use that? Why do we need a new one? Well, I'm only thinking that if you had, on your land use map, you can geographically control where those potential developments could go. That's all.
I think, just to clarify your point or comment, Mr. Kern, that you raised, any property today, if they wanted to rezone their particular property, they would put an application request to the town. So if it was an R2 property and they wanted to say, I wanted to go to R1 or vice versa, that is in the wheelhouse of our zoning allowances today, that proposal would come before the commission as a recommendation, then go to council. That's the rezoning process. It's just that would be initiated by the property owner, whereas today we're initiating this by the town. The last thing that I'll kind of share, I think, to Mr. Iwan's point of specific locations, when we look at these two particular locations of Lower and Upper Beachwalker compared to the entire island, this is where concentrated land uses have been mapped out based on our future land use map. So the entire island has been sort of carved and thought about from a master plan, from a master plan concept area of where areas of concentrated activity occur and lower density areas occur. This commission at this stage can look at that master plan from its timeline of history and saying, as part of this rezoning process, are there modifications to that from a land use pattern standpoint? Staff's recommendation is basically looking at the existing land use patterns and a number of those other things, but really that existing land use pattern is relatively important. The areas of higher density that are currently within our zoning code, it's because those areas have been deemed areas of where people are more likely to, this goes back to sort of a factor of walkability and those types of things of where things are closer and being able to have access to not just a vehicle, single-family residential zoning category. There was one other thing I had a pin and I left it off there. Hopefully it comes back, but I just wanted to share, sort of to wrap this, you guys can look at any of the standards and you can say, hey, we want to adjust the height here. We want to adjust the setbacks here. The flexibility here, and I'm continuing to make this point because it feels like almost I've led you to think that you only can do A or B opposed to really customizing what the zoning could be on the parcel. Ideally, that is really through the plan development process, but I think you do have the flexibility to think truly what you would want to see the standards are for these parcels. Have as many workshops as you want. However, we want to have some, we want to get to a point where we do make a recommendation, of course.
Last comment from me, maybe. I think what I've taken away from the community is we already have what we would call on Keel a pretty high-density development at the beach. And the traffic loading, the infrastructure loading, the complexion of the neighborhood is all weighing into what everybody's thinking about. And so timbers and
Beachwalker, the Cape is a done deal. I think the concern now is, given the complexion in Upper Beachwalker broadly, Inlet Cove specifically, Riverview, it feels like that the density at Beachwalker Lagoon, parcel 11, it feels like it's on the high side, and Ocean Lots, or Ocean Pines is only going to add to that pressure on all of those things. So I'm not making any decisions or saying anything other than that's what it feels like listening to and looking at these numbers and listening to the community is we probably don't want to, designing with nature, thinking about our comprehensive plan, feels like we're putting a really whole lot of loading there, potentially, from the developer standpoint. They've got to make money. They own the property. They have rights. I just think we need to think about how do we balance that loading, that huge density increase, where it's, you know, for the past 20 years, it's been a very low density area, other than just Beachwalker Park and people going to the county park. So.
The only thing I would say is that I
Yep.
think that this has something to do with it, but our problem is our traffic problem, and it would be, it's not, this is not a solution to that. That's got to stand on its own. We've got to come up with a solution with that. You know, this obviously contributed to it, but it's not a solution to it. We need to fix the traffic problem.
Yeah, and I think I totally agree with you. I think that's the least of my concerns. It's just really, we're really changing the complexion of that neighborhood now going forward over the next 5 years versus what it's been. And does that fit with the comprehensive plan? Does it fit with designing in nature? Do our setbacks need to be greater? Do the height restrictions need to be greater? Is that density appropriate with all of those, the comprehensive plan and designing with nature specifically? Just the complexion of the island seems to be changing. But I agree, we've got to deal with traffic separately. It's just another impact that's coming from this density. John,
Let me ask, with respect to a development agreement, we're assuming all this is acceptable or permitted under the current ARDA. Assuming we need to go back and reconstruct, in effect, areas that need to be redefined, if you will, when a development agreement expires. You go back to where the master plan was and whether it was developed, whether it was proposed then.
Yes, unfortunately, you missed that first part of the meeting, which we went into great detail. I'll catch you at lunch and I can give you a briefing on that.
Okay. The answer is yes or no.
The answer is maybe.
We'll find that out.
That's right. I'll tell you. I'll bring you up to speed.
Are there other thoughts or questions? So what I would do again, I think, is based on today's conversation, I like what the comments you just made, Luke, is I'll begin to massage and think of some of those things, and then share something, a document with the commission that I think maybe reflects what I'm hearing. I've only heard one person from this commission really stand firm on one recommendation. That's Ms. Hennessy, of saying we have to revert to a R2 existing, R3 existing. But the comments that I just heard from Luke are really thinking about what might be the more tangible approaches to looking at the parcel. So looking at the specific density, looking at specifically the height. It's kind of in its own bucket. So are there other?
Here, I would go along with what Luke's saying. My point is, we don't want to create a new mixed-use zone. If we want, and we have zoning classifications, if there's some things we could modify with heights and setbacks, I have no problem with that, but I don't want to create a new mixed-use zone by right with these heights and everything.
So it's more so having commercial on, from what I'm hearing, because you recommended residential, but the commercial is more so your concern of what I'm hearing.
I think the community has been telling us they don't want commercial there, so I think we have to, if there's commercial, it has to be a very specific approval for a very specific commercial use. as opposed to a broad category with a lot of permitted uses, because then we lose control.
Okay.
There seems to be an assumption that we're gonna have a big commercial center down there. I don't know what has been even suggested, never mind proposed.
There's not been
Is
a,
that part of the meeting too?
so the allowances that have been proposed is not a laundry list of commercial uses that would be permitted in this BW1 and BW2. Thinking just broadly, I think the biggest ones from, would be a restaurant, and that would require special exception based on what's being proposed. Small office or office is built into that. So if there are specific commercial uses that are definitely uncomfortable, please share those with me. But this isn't an extensive list compared to our standard commercial zoning district that would allow a greater list of uses.
I think it's now time we'd like to hear any comments from our residents, if you have some. Please, come up and state your name and address, please.
As you're coming up, thank you very much for sitting through 2.5 hours of this and being very patient.
Very patient.
I'm Linda Leffler, 60 Sunlit Bend, from Inlet Cove. I appreciate the time and discussion that has been going on. We appreciate the modifications anyway. I guess what struck me back in 1994, Beachwalker was special, under special development. And we 3 communities that live in that area consider it special. You took my thunder away, but I think you summarized things very well. We've been hitting hard with the developer about the density in these areas. That is of great concern, particularly with your designing with nature that says that new communities should fit in with surrounding communities. And we don't understand how 4-story communities fit in with our 1 to 2-story communities. But more than that, we are special because of Beachwalker Drive. There's no way to expand that road. And you have to understand, once Ocean Pines is built, 2/3 of Ocean Pines is coming out on Beachwalker, plus any commercial activity, meaning people that change linens, they need food trucks, they're all going down Beachwalker. And when Upper Beachwalker is developed, all of that naturally will come out on Beachwalker Drive. So what do you do with these vehicles? The gentleman there said just coming out today was challenging. You go around that area around lunchtime at the general store, it's challenging with everyone coming there for lunch. So with that in mind, I'm just talking about residential. Why add any commercial to that area? I don't see any need for it. We have plenty of commercial use over at Freshfields. So why have any commercial in Beachwalker Drive at all? Like I said, there's no real, I'm sure they'll come up with some solution for Beachwalker Drive, but how good it's going to be, I don't know. That's a lot of traffic on there. And if you've ever been down there on a holiday or weekend now, it's loaded with people just coming to Beachwalker Park. So add that in the mix. So thank you for your summary, but I wanted to emphasize those things also.
I'm Cynthia Hadley, and I live at 1234 Kiawah Beach Drive. I'm part of Greens Lake. And I want to thank you all for your service
on this planning commission, really appreciate it. And I loved your summary, but I felt that as a community member who's been here for the last 2.5 hours, that I really wanted to make sure the record reflected that that all of the work that's being done on Beachwalker and the intense use it's getting, I would encourage you to not think about the 40-plus years of the ARDA, but to think about the future and to take that into consideration. And of course, I'm Upper Beachwalker with the parcels that won't be voted on this afternoon, but I would hate to see them become very similar to what's going on with the Timbers and the Cape and now with Ocean Pines. So again, thank you so much for the work you're doing, and I'd really like you to continue to consider what the community is concerned about. Thank you.
I'm John Fly, 102 Bellmead Hall. And I also thank the members of the commission for your hard work. I know it is hard work. I've served on a variety of commissions in the state of South Carolina over my years, and into which a lot of people put a lot of work, and too often it just made no difference. So I know what that feels like when you get to that point. I will also say I sat in yesterday with the town council meeting and looking at, I've been a student of decision-making and governance processes for a long time. Looking at yesterday and today, it looks really, really good compared to how the House of Representatives is run. I think that's called damning with faint praise. That's a pretty low bar. But I do know that public sector decision-making offers its own challenges. I've worked in an autocracy, and it was easy to make decisions. Yesterday, I got a very clear reading that the public input, which is a part of public sector decision-making, that the public input was basically being blown off as annoying road noise. Some of the comments around this table today are rather more encouraging. It's clear that members of this planning commission have been paying attention to the public comments and taking them seriously. So I particularly thank you for that. Also came away, and this may be unfair, but there's nothing in my contract that requires me to be fair. I got the feeling yesterday that maybe this planning commission is not too much more than a speed bump in the process that's underway. If the same decision-making process moves forward with the properties on Beachwalker that has taken place, well, for the Timbers and the Cape, we'll get about the same result. The developer's good at what they do. I begrudgingly admire them. They've been playing cards at this table for a long time, and the only hand I know of that they ever lost was on Captain Sam Spit, and they didn't lose it in the town hall. They lost it at the state Supreme Court. So they know how to play this game, and as I look at this rezoning that's being proposed for Beachwalker, it basically looks like the developer asking to be dealt a second hand of cards. They're holding a hand of cards now under their existing development agreements, and they have plans submitted under those development agreements, which they fully expect to be approved with very minor amendments. It was also clear in the meeting yesterday that people sitting at the dais expected much the same result. So it looks like your rezoning efforts, for all the thought you're putting into them, are only a backup hand of cards in case the first hand of cards doesn't play well or doesn't offer prospects more attractive for the developer than what they may get approved or what they will get approved under the existing development agreements. As I watch this body, and this is an important body for a town like Keogh, which is the balloon is getting full here, folks, so now your work becomes particularly important. I asked myself, this is not really a decision-making body. You decide to make a recommendation. So it seems like you're a consultative body more than a decision-making body. And it's not clear to me whether you're making recommendations to the town council or to the planning staff. A saying that we used to have in my organization in roles like this is, you said, we're not here to ask questions. We're here to question answers. So you ask hard questions, and when you don't get answers that make as much sense to you as they should, you question the answers. You come back with harder questions. I'm not sure I saw as much as I would like to of that attitude of questioning answers in a manner that is commensurate with the responsibility that you have. Alan Dershowitz, the attorney, says that he's, over his career, handled more than half of his cases pro bono. And I'm sure that over my lifetime, more than half of the advice I've given has been given pro bono. And I guarantee you that when I give you free advice, it's worth every penny you pay. So I will try to provide that context. I was glad to see that the recommendations for the details on the zoning had been amended downward since the 26th, when they did receive some serious pushback. But again, when I think about decision-making processes, I know how people always present initial proposals. Anytime somebody put a budget proposal in front of me, they knew and I knew that they had excess request in the budget proposal because they expected it to get pushed back. They expected to be told to go away, cut it 10% and come back, which they did, and it didn't take them long because they already knew when they put it together the first time where the 10% they were going to cut was. So when I saw the slight downward tweak in what was proposed for the details of the proposed zoning, it was no surprise. Clearly what was initially proposed was inflated. And I think that was brought to our attention. And there was no pain involved in tweaking it slightly downward. So I realize that some of the things I've just said have been sort of ugly. I do apologize for that. These are not only complicated and confusing issues, they are by nature contentious issues. And I'm sorry that you're in jobs where you have to deal with that contention. It's never any fun, but it is a great responsibility. And I thank you for taking on that responsibility.
Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, and those in attendance. Excuse me. My name is Mark Primar, 81 Dungannon Hall, but I'm here representing the property owners of some of the parcels in question for Kiowa Partners. I do have a few comments in concert with the attendees relative to a range of things, but I have a series of questions, if possible, concerns, and some recommendations. In general, we support this effort, excuse me, support this effort to reconsider zoning classifications for the transition parcels, many of which have already transitioned to other property owners. So, for example, the first wave of Mingo Point parcels and a range of others, Riverview, are good examples of appropriately adjusting the zoning to what has evolved in those parcels. So we support that. On the second spreadsheet, the one that we discussed today, the updated version. Excuse me just a minute. We do support the concept of considering some additional zoning classifications in the array of districts for the town. The reason we support that is we think that is a reflection of how Kiowa has evolved over time. And let me give you a good example. The R3 classification, which is a base classification, allows for 2-story buildings and 4 units in a building. We have, up to this point, 133 non-conforming units in West Beach and 355 non-conforming units in East Beach as a result of that zoning classification, which was presented and approved by a prior town council. Let's see, what is that, 488 units that were previously approved with standards that allowed for building permits to be issued. By that simple zoning classification change, created that enumerated number of non-conforming uses. Despite the best efforts of the more recent update of this, what we just went through with John, it will add another 235 units that are either built or are under construction or in site plan review right now that meet standards. It doesn't make sense to me. I understand what Ms. Hennessy said. It doesn't make sense to me to be proactively generating non-conforming structures. It's a sign. It's not just a handful. As a community, you want to have fewer non-conforming uses and structures, not more. The reason that's important is not just, well, in the future, if they need to do this or that, they can request changes. We are on the front line in America of pressures on the insurance industry and loans, where there's an increasing pressure for property owners, not developers, but property owners who have to answer questions about renewals on loans or insurance projects. Do you meet existing town or community standards? I am predicting that this will be more impactful, the whole notion of non-conforming uses. So the idea of reflecting on the evolution of Kiowa in terms of building types, and it's not just big buildings. Go through Courtside, a single building that's smaller than a typical house. It's 2 stories, has 8 units in it. It's non-conforming. It's in comparison to Shipwatch, which is 4 stories, 44 units, I think. Or no, it's 64 units. Non-conforming. The largest buildings in Westwood, drive through, the overwhelming majority of multifamily now are going to be non-conforming. We don't want it, as a community, we don't want that. It's not to say that there's not appropriate location for R3 categories, but we should be reflective of the evolution of a community. So I'm suggesting that we reflect on this in terms of the allocations attributed to both existing development and ongoing construction and site plan approval within the upper Beachwalker area and parcel 13. Do we really want to create non-conforming conditions? As it relates to parcels 12A and 12B, this is effectively downzoning. Now, the 12B is more aligned. That we would support that. That is the R1 category for the Captain Sam's parcel. But 12A is not just the PRC parcel, it's additional land. So I think we need to reflect, I'm just suggesting we reflect on that in terms of the downzoning of property of not just the lease area, but adjacent areas attributed to it. As it relates to recommendations, again, I'm here standing on behalf of Kiowa Partners. We need to transition from a development agreement world to a non-development agreement world, other than the resort development world, development agreement world. The conversation that opened today about the zoning map, what happens if we just, as a community, can't figure out an alternative way, which I'm going to have a recommendation with that to close with. If we can't come together and we default to the termination date, what is the zoning map for the island? I only heard this earlier today, so I haven't had time to reflect on it. But I would suggest our judgment would be the existing zoning map that was approved by prior councils that reflects the 2010, and I think it was amended in 2011, for the entirety of the island is the zoning map. It's not like questionable in our minds, because if that's not the case, then the entire island doesn't have a zoning map. But that reflects the zoning classifications independent of a development agreement, because there are things on even the Kiowa Partners parcels which are not in the development agreement, which are not consistent with that zoning map. But that zoning map is the default to go to. But it sounds like we need to have clarification at that point. Okay, now I don't want to end with what might be perceived as negatives. I want to end with a recommendation, particularly for Upper Beachwalker. As we know, we've been on a parallel path with 2 site plans for Ocean Park, Parcel 13, Lot 1, which we believe meets all of the standards, but we're awaiting to hear that officially. We believe also that the standards for a site plan that's been submitted for Upper Beachwalker meets the standards too, but again, we understand that. We understand there may be outside professional review of both those. If that's what's needed, that's great, because we believe we've met those standards. But on Upper Beachwalker, it is apparent by the range of concerns by property owners, as well as the range of questions raised by commission members, it essentially requires a special way of thinking. That quilt of multiple parcels diminishes the opportunity for comprehensive planning and development of the parcel. Those are arbitrary property lines that evolved over the history of the Kuwaitis selling off parcels and then subsequent developers buying parcels back. Originally, that was all one parcel by the original Kuwaiti entity. But over time, it's the quilt. I am suggesting that a combination of thought leaders in the community that they would select from their homeowners associations, select members of the Planning Commission, and some members of the Kiowa Partners have a work session and see if you can arrive at an appropriate comprehensive way of looking for the entire parcel, rather than establishing a piecemeal approach. Present that recommendation in a workshop to the greater community, if it's possible to come to a conclusion. Have another workshop where there's an attempt to do that. Now, that might be in the form of a planned development district or a new district, whatever it is, but it's a conscious effort for our community, and I'm including all of us in the word community, coming together with a simple act of, can we figure out something that in fact benefits the greater community? And when I use the word community, I'm talking about all of us, not just a few. But we would present it, that committee then can present it in a workshop setting where there's an opportunity to reflect on a greater whole. And if still there's no conclusion, I understand that we have to go to the core plan. But that is a recommendation. So the one question I do have if you'll allow me, or a couple of questions I do have, is in the prior actions of parcel 40, it's a parcel, bear with me here, parcel 41, which is where the Kiawah Island Beach Club is, or parcel 16, where the club members, the golf course and clubhouse and so forth. At parcel 51, is the beach club a permitted use as a matter of right in this new zoning classification or the new strategy? And on parcel 16, which is a settlement, is the spa a permitted use within the park and recreation activity? And at some time, it would be good to have an answer. We don't want to, again, create more non-conforming uses. Thank you. Appreciate it.
I want to thank John for his presentation. The first time I ever met you, and I thought you did an excellent job and giving me a lot of insight in things that I am not aware of. My name, again, is James Caltabiano, property owner, 56 Inlet Cove. I'm going to read a mission statement, and I have also a comment to make. This mission statement is to preserve and enhance the quality of life and property values of its members, and I'm a member. This includes taking the leadership role in ensuring that Kiawah Island's unique look and feel is preserved by exceptional stewardship of its resources, which provide for a beautiful, safe, well-maintained, and friendly community. Okay, so that's the mission statement of the Kiawah Island Community Association. And I'm sure the zoning board here has its own statement, which I would look forward to it being very close to this one, that it's all kind of like cohesive approach to what occurs on Kiawah Island. I can state for myself, I won't state for anyone else, but for this mission statement to be carried out for me, it would entail no development along Beach Walker Drive, none. So anything that occurs beyond that is kind of like compromising my feelings about what this mission statement means to me. The other thing, too, is that the zoning board, I think, needs to not consider development and considering, well, they need to make a buck, too. I believe I heard that today. The zoning board needs to, make decisions that is going to be best for the community and for the island. And I hope, some of the proposals today, I think addresses that. I think there's a long way that it can even go further. Because the community feels good the way things are now. Pristine, peaceful, beautiful, not congested, not additional traffic flow down and back through Beach Walker Drive with no real understanding as far as the impacts of that, safety-wise, noise pollution-wise, environmentally wise, for the natural aspects along that stretch of the island. And I really hope that whatever gets concluded towards the end keeps that very much at the priority of everyone's working list. Thank you.